Kerbal Space Program 2 was announced, the huge sequel for the original Kerbal Space Program. This popped up in my head recently and I was thinking, man, what a disaster. This honestly, to date, has to be one of the biggest letdowns that I've felt in gaming so far. The original KSP literally inspired a whole generation to become astrophysicists and astronauts, so it's pretty shocking to see that the second installment of this legendary series fell short this hard. It was originally announced in 2019 and was then later released in early access in 2023 for the full price of $50. Thousands of players picked up the game upon release, and there were quite a few concurrent players on at the time. However, a few months down the line, the studio shut down. There was no extra support past that, so it's essentially been 2 years now of there being essentially zero word of there ever being a comeback of the series. And as a result, you can see the Steam numbers, they really do speak for themselves. And Kerbal Space Program 2 ended up going from being a complete spiritual successor to just another abandoned early access title. Today, we're going to go back, have a look at the full timeline of what happened, just the hard information and what went wrong, and why this, for me personally, and I'm sure for a lot of you guys as well, is one of the biggest disappointments in recent time. Stick around for the lessons that every game dev and fan should learn. Why was the launch of KSP2 so highly anticipated? The original Kerbal Space Program had its full release in 2015 by a company called Squad, and it essentially became a full-on indie phenomenon. It was highly moddable, you could easily replay it for a lot of hours. And at the same time it taught you something. So what isn't there to like about this? It's essentially just a physics sandbox where you can build your own rockets or run a whole space agency depending if you choose to just play sandbox or the career mode. You can design your own rockets and aircraft and things like that. Everything is built part by you, and you can get more parts from mods and loads of things like that. You launch your rocket, fail, try again, and the satisfaction you get from actually making something work that you've designed is incredible. The map that you get to explore is essentially a recreation of the solar system, so you have all the planets just renamed different things, as instead of humans, the people living on Earth, or as it's called in KSP, Kerbin, are called Kerbals. So it's essentially got that little comic twist in there, which sort of makes it more appealing to a younger audience as well, as it takes itself less seriously. However, it does have that full-on depth with actual astrophysics and everything else that you'd expect. KSP had 8+ years of free updates, which just turned it into an absolute masterpiece, and the fans were then waiting after those 8 years for a potential sequel as the graphics started to get a bit more dated, and there were a lot of things that were missing from the game, for example making bases on planets and things like that. Some of this of course was alleviated by mods, so the demand for KSP2 was definitely there. The original built up such a fan base and became known for essentially just being endless fun, and there was a whole community built around this, and the whole community was setting their eyes on the future to see the potential coming of a new sequel. So in August 2019 at Gamescom is when KSP2 was actually announced. It was finally coming and the fans could finally rejoice. And then early access was planned for 2020, just the next year. It was initially developed by a studio called Star Theory, but Take-Two, the parent company, essentially pulled it. So we essentially have Star Theory here, and this is Take-Two, and they essentially squashed them. And out of this came the formation of a new studio called Intercept Games, which caused many of the original devs that were working on KSP2 to jump ship. As you might remember, around 2020 we had the whole virus thing, so that combined with the studio transition essentially pushed the launch back to 24th of Feb 2023, 3 years later after the initial announcement date that was given. The demos and gameplays that we saw of this, that was showing all the new stuff, was super exciting. We finally got those cool planetary bases that you could set up, which is one of the things that I was mainly looking for. Better graphics, better physics, it was all there. It was also promising multiplayer, which would have been huge for KSP. And of course, it came with new parts, propulsion systems, and all the other stuff you'd expect. Stuff that was previously already added with mod packs for the original KSP, but now coming to the full release of KSP 2. So now let's take a look at when it actually launched. It launched February 24th, 2023, and it had an all-time peak of 11 to 25k, which isn't that impressive, but for a niche game like this, if you guys are enjoying this video, then please don't forget to leave a sub and help me reach 1k subs. I'd really appreciate it. And also smash like and leave a comment, please. I think what didn't help it is the fact that it was early access. People weren't very hopeful of it. Although the original KSP was early access as well. However, when you have a game like this built up under a big publisher like Take-Two, and you still can't deliver, you start questioning things, you know? And these people were right to ask those questions, as you probably know what happened after that. When people boosted up KSP 2 after launch, the problems became immediately clear. The performance was atrocious. You could get 20-30 FPS just turning a few thrusters on at a time. Going back through atmosphere would absolutely crash your FPS as well. The only time it'd actually run okay is if there was nothing going on and you were stood still. The more parts you put on your spaceship, the worse it ran. However, in KSP 2, if you tried to remotely make something that would sort of even be feasible in real life, you'd run into problems. The bugs were everywhere as well. We had these weird strut failures, little bendy rockets. Yeah, it was quite funny to watch, but at the same time it was a bit concerning. And there were also a lot of features missing from the original KSP, as the science and career mode weren't in the game, and the colonies and multiplayer that was promised just wasn't there at launch at all. It was early access of course, so people still had hope. The reviews initially started at 50% over the first few days, however as you know now, they've dropped all the way down to 25%, which I can't really name anything of recent that's performed that bad. The player count essentially collapsed to have less than 100 people playing at once easily. But this didn't stop people from hoping. There was still hope. The original KSP was early access, and it came with a few issues, so why couldn't this be fixed? And since then, there was one major update, which was the full science update, which came in December of 2023. And it brought an exploration mode, a few of the bugs were fixed, and it was received pretty positively, but it was just nowhere near enough to save the game. There were a few smaller patches after that, but then the last one came in June 2024. And ever since then there was pretty much silence. The fact that we only saw a major update after a whole 8 months, and then we only had those little things since then, most people's hopes pretty quickly evaporated away. People were also starting to speculate why this was the case, what was happening behind the scenes. And then it finally, after a few months, all became clear. In May of 2024, Bloomberg reported that Take-Two Interactive essentially shut down Intercept Games. But the company and the CEO, which is behind KSP 2, denied it at first. And a few weeks later, the whole 70 people team was laid off, which was actually confirmed by the devs as seen on their LinkedIns. In November of 2024, Take-Two sells Private Division, which was KSP 2's label, to an unknown investor. And in 2026, the game is still on sale at full price, but with seemingly zero support after the initial early access release. And there was never any official cancellation or proper update as to what was going on. But it's effectively dead and abandoned, and has been for almost 2 years. So what was the real reason behind KSP's 2 disastrous launch, and why did it fail? The technical foundation on which KSP 2 was laid on was in terrible shape, rotten to its core, terrible optimization from day one, and the scope was massively ambitious. Being able to form multiplayer and colonies on such shaky code is questionable, and as you can see now, it just wasn't realistic. One of the biggest hits was the fact that they switched between 2 different studios. Loads of the key people that were originally working on it left, which in game development that just means a whole big mess that's pretty hard to come back from. Take-Two expected this to be some big AAA title, and they pushed out way too fast. They charged the full $50 expecting a release that would make them solid money. However, as you can see, their short-term thinking was essentially detrimental to them over time. KSP2 succeeded through different iterations, help from communities, and the devs community working together made sure that KSP1 succeeded. However, KSP2 tried to skip the start and rush the marathon and essentially tripped up at the end and lost. The true lesson we have to learn from this is that early access works, but only if there's full-on transparency and we know what's going on. Kerbal Space Program 2 has become a cautionary tale of what happens when you pit hype against delivery. The good news is, it hasn't completely killed the franchise. People are still very passionate about the first KSP. However, it's just kind of sad that we don't fully have that second sequel that we can go and enjoy. And it's sad that you have to revert and go back to that 11-year-old game again. I think if KSP2 was allowed to be developed without the rush and squeeze from Take-Two, there was none of these studio switches purely down to monetary gain, it would have succeeded and actually worked out in the end. We may have only seen the title come out, say 2027, 2028, but we actually would have had something feasible. This is just another story of big titles that people love being screwed over for a short-term monetary gain. But what do you think is happening behind the scenes with this, since it was bought by a private investor? Do you think it could ever come back in the future with a new title? We know for a fact it is completely unfeasible to work on KSP2, as it just is essentially painting over rotten wood at this point. But could we see a return? Let me know in the comments what you think.